I'm honored by Rabbi Amanda Russell and the congregation to be asked to present the Devar Torah for Parsha Chayei Sarah. I present my thoughts in memory of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Harav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Arieh, Zichron Livracha, who passed away this past Shabbos, Saturday, the 7th of November, 2020, Shabbat Kodesh, 20th Mar Cheshvan, 5781 in London, England. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory possessed and shared profound learning, moral depth, and sheer eloquence. His knowledge of Jewish and secular texts and his ability to synthesize connections between them was unparalleled. It was this that made him a leading religious figure, not only within contemporary Judaism, but throughout the world. Each of the 3 meetings and conversations we had over the past 20 years became a shiur, a conversation we had in lessons in how to look at the world and how to experience our relationship to the Creator. I will continue to learn from him through his prolific and deeply insightful writings. Chayei Sarah. There's so much here. While the title, translated as the life or the lifetime of Sarah, implies that we will be reviewing the life of Sarah, we actually begin with the death of Sarah and conclude with the death and burial of Abraham, punctuated by the finding of a bride for Isaac and his betrothal to Rebekah. Implicitly embedded in the narrative may be the recovery of Isaac from the trauma of the Akedah and his finding comfort and love with Rebekah after the death of his mother Sarah. Isaac becoming a life partner is the essential necessity of the continuity to become a great nation that God promised in his 2-part covenant with Abraham. This is a story of how large visions have small beginnings. They are built one act at a time, requiring a long time horizon, faith, and human agency. The arc of the story involves a couple, a monogamous wife and a profligate husband, who hear and act upon a voice that seemingly heretofore went unheard or at least unheeded. They depart the land of their forebears, they become the other in a new land, and they begin to worship one God who actively speaks to them and provides both vision and guidance. It's perhaps ironic that the parasha is named for Sarah. We might expect her to have a starring role. Other than her name, she's almost absent, other than her passing and the fact that her son Isaac maintains her tent. It is worth wondering whether this absence represents a cultural clash between an ascendant patriarchy and a vanishing matriarchy. Embedded as sub-narratives are the first death and burial of the people of Israel. Relatedly, the acquisition and consecration of the first parcel of land in the promised land, the second element of the covenant, and our recognition of our people as resident aliens from our very beginning, among others. So let us take a brief look at each of these themes, each which could be a drash alone. The Torah never explicitly tells what happens to Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac after the Akedah. We are left to speculation and midrash. The parsha begins with Sarah's death. Abraham is bereft and he must find an appropriate place for her interment. Abraham goes to visit the leadership of the Hittite tribe that controls the area to negotiate the purchase of such a place. He self-identifies as a resident alien, a ger toshav, as the status that he has prevents him from owning land. Here the Hebrew is imprecise. It's not clear if Abraham is asking the Hittites to give, sell, or allow him to pay for a burial place. The Hittites will freely give a burial place to Abraham as they view him, quote, the elect of God among us. In the process of identifying a cave at Machpelah, current-day Hebron, and its owner, Abraham enters into what appears to be a classic Middle Eastern negotiation. In a back and forth, he appears to end up paying an outsized sum to accomplish his objective of interring his wife Sarah, and in the process, establishing a legal foothold of land ownership in the covenantally promised land for the first time. It's a lesson of how we must execute our own agency in order to make God's promises come to fruition. It's from this narrative that nascent Jewish communities around the world first organizational task is the creation of a Hever Kadisha, a holy burial society, which comes before organizing a synagogue, school, mikveh, or benevolent association. It is also from this negotiation with the Hittites that Abraham identified himself as a resident alien. He does not know if his neighbors will accept him as a fellow resident or continue to see him as an interloper in their midst. In the negotiation process, he sees that they admire him based on the values he lives. Throughout our history, Jews have lived as resident aliens in many different lands. And to this day, we have strong feelings of identification with immigrants, particularly those who dwell among us. The next step in the narrative has Abraham instructing his senior servant to go to the land of his birth to find an appropriate wife for Isaac. Abraham's adamant that Isaac not find a wife from among the resident Canaanites and that Isaac, also not return to the land of Abraham's birth with the servant. While Abraham does not give instruction to his servant regarding specific character traits for such a bride, the servant, seemingly intuitive what a mate for Isaac needs to bring to complement such a marriage, goes with the goal of identifying a prospective bride whose countenance is an expression of kindness and an expression of generosity. The senior servant meets Rebekah at a well in an oasis in Abraham's native land, and her offering of water for him and her arduous task of watering 10 camels quickly indicates that she has the requisite character traits along with the beauty and grace he's looking for. The servant is then brought as a guest to her home, where he meets her mother and her brother and learns that Rebekah is Abraham's great niece. The servant proposes a shidduch, and while we will gloss over the details, Rebekah and her nurse depart for her home for Canaan. As the journey concludes, Rebekah and Isaac see each other from afar, and their gazes lock. 3 sentences later, the text says, Isaac then brought into the tent of his mother Sarah and took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. We note that he loved her subsequently to consummating the marriage. Seemingly subsequently, we learn of Abraham having many additional offspring, their relationship to his estate, and then of his death. For the first time, we encounter the phrase, and he was gathered unto his kin. Our sages tell us that it introduces the concept that death is not an end, but a transition to an afterlife in another world, Gan Eden or Haba Olam, where one is reunited with one's ancestors. Abraham was buried by 2 of his many sons, half-brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, in the cave at Machpelah, which was acquired upon the death of Sarah. After the death of Abraham, God blesses Isaac, and the continuity of the covenant with Abraham has become secured. Quoting Etz Chaim, the parasha marks the transition from one generation to the next. It begins with Sarah's death and concludes with Abraham's. The centerpiece theme is finding the right wife and partner for marriage with Isaac, so that the special traditions of Sarah and Abraham continue beyond their lifetimes and potentially the life of their son. I would like to conclude quoting Rabbi Lord Sachs, who prepared a commentary of this week's parsha prior to his death this last week. Quote, perhaps, though, the most important point of this parsha is that large promises, a land and countless children, become real through small beginnings. Leaders begin with an envisioned future, but they also know that there's a long journey between here and there. We can only reach it one act at a time, one day at a time. There's no miraculous shortcut. And if there were, it would not help. Abraham acquired only a single field and had just one son who would continue the covenant. Yet he did not complain, and he died serene and satisfied. Because he'd begun, because he had left future generations something on which to build. All great change is the work of more than one generation, and none of us will live to see the full fruit of our endeavors. Leaders see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind them those who will continue it. That's enough to endure a life with immortality.